She was the queen who redefined power, and paid for it with her head. But what if everything they told you about her crimes was a lie? You wake before dawn to the sound of steel being sharpened. Not a sword clashing in battle, nor a ceremonial blade polished for display. No, this sound is slow, rhythmic, deliberate, the scraping of metal against stone. A craftsman at work, preparing the tool that will separate your soul from your flesh. It is May 19th, 1536. You are Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, and in just a few hours, that blade will fall across the back of your neck. The stone walls of your chamber pulse in time with your heartbeat. You are no longer a queen in these walls, you are prey, a condemned woman, pacing within the same tower that had once received you in triumph. The irony clings to the air, like the scent of river mist and incense smoke. A scent of rot, of old stones steeped in centuries of sorrow, and the faint, sweet perfume of prayers whispered in desperation for your soul. Outside, carpenters hammer wood into place. They are building your final stage, the scaffold. Each strike of the mallet against the timber is a countdown, a drumbeat of doom echoing through the tower and into your bones. You sit still as your ladies dress you, but your hands betray you, trembling not from cold, but from the unbearable weight of knowing. You're clothed in gray damask with a white chemise beneath the Tudor colors of mourning and purity. The irony slices sharper than any executioner's sword. These were not your choices. The king chose them. Even in death, Henry controls the narrative. He will not let the world see a proud queen wronged, but a penitent woman humbled before the law of man and the whims of a tyrant. Your ladies in waiting once, your confidantes, now your silent watchers move about the room like ghosts. They too are dressed in muted tones, their faces pale, their eyes hollowed by grief and fear. They do not cry, not yet. There is no room in this morning for indulgence. This is a ritual, and every moment of it is soaked in meaning. The air in the tower has always been thick, but today it feels heavier, as though the walls themselves are pressing inward, shrinking around you. From the chapel nearby, the scent of incense drifts in on the wind, mixing with the metallic sting of your own fear. The monks chant low, solemn prayers for your soul, but even their Latin benedictions seem to hesitate as they pass your door. And behind that door, the shuffle of boots on stone, the clink of mail and armor, the mechanisms of execution moving toward their final positions. You are not alone in this building. You are the central piece in an elaborate, carefully choreographed machine of death. You are the spectacle, the sacrifice. But you were once so much more. The woman they will kill today was once the most powerful figure in England, after the king. She captivated a monarch, changed the religion of an entire kingdom, and gave birth to a daughter who, though illegitimate by the state's decree, would carry your blood into history's bloodstream. How did it come to this? To understand the end, we must go back not to the charge sheets or the confessions, but to a cradle never filled. For your doom did not begin with treason or adultery. It began with grief. January 1536. A winter so cold it froze the Thames. Inside your private chambers, you bleed once more, not from the executioner's sword, but from the miscarriage of another child. A son, the child who could have secured your place, who might have justified Henry's years of defiance and rebellion. The child who died the same day Henry fell unconscious after a violent jousting accident, his armor dented, his body broken, his breath shallow for 2 hours. The symbolism was not lost on the court. As the king lay near death, so too did the hopes of the Boleyn dynasty. Some whispered of divine punishment. Others saw political opportunity. You were not just a grieving mother, you were a vulnerable queen. Henry's grief twisted swiftly into something darker. His faith in you, already strained, began to decay. He, who once tore the fabric of Christendom to make you his wife, now whispered that your union had been cursed by God. And so began the theological betrayal. The very arguments Henry had used to annul his first marriage, that Catherine of Aragon had once been his brother's wife, and thus their marriage was invalid, were now sharpened and turned against you. The same logic, the same religious gymnastics. This time, you were the sinner, the cursed one. But spiritual doubt was not enough. Not for Henry. He needed more than whispers of divine displeasure. He needed evidence, legal grounds, a constructed truth that would preserve his own image and strip you of sympathy, especially for the sake of your daughter Elizabeth. That is where Thomas Cromwell entered the stage. He was Henry's chief minister, a man who had risen not by blood, but by brilliance. A man who knew survival at court meant anticipating the king's unspoken desires. And Cromwell saw clearly. The king wanted Anne gone, but not just removed, erased. So Cromwell set about building a case so brutal, so depraved, that no voice could rise in your defense without risking the same fate. You would not simply be accused, you would be demonized. And the first stone in the avalanche was a court musician named Mark Smeaton. Mark Smeaton was no nobleman. He had no titles, no land, no powerful family to shelter him from what was to come. He was a musician, talented, dark-haired, charming. His music had once delighted the court, his presence welcomed even in noble company, and that was enough to make him dangerous. On April 30th, 1536, Smeaton was arrested under Cromwell's orders and taken not to a traditional prison, but to Cromwell's own house in Stepney. There, behind closed doors, a different kind of performance began, not of song or lute, but of pressure, pain, and fear. No official records describe what was done to him in that house, but the silence of the archives speaks volumes. What emerged from that house was not the same man. Smeaton had entered denying any improper relationship with the Queen. He left confessing to adultery with her, complete with specific details, dates, and scenarios, all precisely what Cromwell needed. But what kind of man makes such confessions under his own will? The answer lies in the broken spirit Cromwell knew how to extract. A low-born man, isolated from allies, likely faced with the instruments of torture or the threat of death, might say anything to make the agony stop. Smeaton's confession would become the cornerstone of the prosecution, the linchpin that turned rumor into accusation and whispers into scaffold planks. It was also a masterstroke of political calculus. By beginning with a commoner, Cromwell could set the tone. Establish a narrative of sexual betrayal that would taint all other accused. And if a queen had laid with a man beneath her station, what depravity might she not be capable of? But one confession wasn't enough. Not for the kind of destruction Cromwell was planning. On May 1st, just one day later, Henry Norris, the king's groom of the stool and one of his most trusted confidants, was arrested. The timing was no accident. It was May Day, a celebration of spring, fertility, and joy. A festival meant for renewal and hope. But Cromwell twisted even this symbol into something poisonous. Norris had spent more than a decade by Henry's side. He was no fool. He knew the risks of courtly life, but even he must have felt the floor vanish beneath him as he was dragged away from Greenwich Palace, accused not just of adultery with the Queen, but of treason against the king he had served so loyally. Under interrogation, Norris refused to confess. His silence could have meant many things: a sense of virtue, a belief in his innocence. His silence could have meant many things: a sense of virtue, a belief in his innocence, or perhaps simply the recognition that a confession would not save him but seal his fate. In this theater, everyone was already cast. There were no alternate endings. 3 days later, William Brereton joined him in the Tower. Brereton was a man from the Welsh Marches, a region where loyalty to the crown was often purchased with privilege rather than earned through birth. His appointment to the king's privy chamber was not inevitable, it had been a reward, and now it was being revoked. Brereton's accusation followed the same pattern: adultery with the Queen. but with an added twist: conspiracy to murder the king. The story, fabricated or not, painted Anne not just as unfaithful, but as treasonous. As a woman who, like the biblical Jezebel, would wield her lovers to bring down the throne and seat herself beside a puppet king. Each layer of the accusation was designed with care. To accuse Anne of infidelity was scandalous. To accuse her of conspiring to kill Henry was monstrous. The inclusion of Sir Francis Weston, arrested on May 5th, added yet another texture. Weston was young, just 25, recently married, and from a wealthy family. He had no reason to risk everything for an affair with the Queen. Yet his arrest gave the accusations a cruel elegance. Old loyalty, Norris; political gain, Brereton; base desire, Smeaton; and now youthful recklessness, Weston. The pattern was clear. Anne was being framed, not just as adulterous, but insatiable, manipulative. Anne was being framed not just as adulterous, but insatiable, manipulative, and capable of pulling men from every corner of courtly life into her web. The Queen was becoming a symbol of female corruption, a personification of chaos, cloaked in silk and pearls. But Cromwell saved his most devastating blow for last. On May 2nd, George Boleyn, Anne's own brother, was arrested and charged with incest. The accusation stunned even the jaded court of Henry VIII. Incest was beyond scandal. It was the abomination that made even political enemies draw breath and clutch pearls. No matter their views on Anne, few could process this accusation without revulsion. George Boleyn was intelligent, eloquent, and politically astute. George Boleyn was intelligent, eloquent, and politically astute, everything Anne was. He had defended her at court, stood by her side in theological debates, and wielded power in his own right. But loyalty made him dangerous. In Cromwell's eyes, it made him expendable. To accuse him of incest was to destroy not just George, but the very idea of Anne as a human being. She was no longer a queen or a wife. She was a seductress from whom no man, not even her own blood, was safe. And yet, within this horror lay genius. Because who would dare defend Anne now? To speak on her behalf would be to defend the unthinkable. The charges weren't meant to be believed, they were meant to isolate. And it worked. In just 5 days, Cromwell had constructed a deadly lattice of accusations, confessions, and political theater. A machine so precise in its cruelty that there was no time for Anne's allies to respond, only enough time to watch, in horror, as the noose tightened around the Queen's neck. Anne's arrest came that same day, May 2nd. She had just returned from watching a tennis match at Greenwich, where Henry himself played alongside Francis Weston, one of the men now accused of sleeping with her. The symmetry was not coincidental. The choreography of humiliation was in motion. And then, the final twist of the knife. The charges were read aloud to her by her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. A man whose title had been elevated, thanks to the Boleyns, now sealing his niece's doom to maintain favor at court. Anne's reaction? Laughter. Not amusement. Despair. The idea that she, constantly watched, shadowed by courtiers and ladies, could have orchestrated 5 separate affairs and a plot to murder the king was absurd. But laughter gave way to silence as the full scope of the accusations was revealed. Treason, incest, adultery, murder. Anne's world collapsed, not with a sudden blow, but a slow-motion avalanche, engineered with cold brilliance, and it had only just begun. The name Mark Smeaton would, under other circumstances, have faded into obscurity. A talented musician briefly favored at court, remembered only for the songs he played in candle-lit halls. But history had other plans. Smeaton's fate was sealed not by ambition, but by proximity. He played too well, smiled too easily, lingered too long in the orbit of power. That he was not noble made him the perfect scapegoat, expendable, easily broken, and unable to summon protectors in high places. When Cromwell summoned him to his house in Stepney, it was not for music. There, in the silent chambers away from courtly eyes, Mark Smeaton was interrogated alone. No record survives of what was done to him in those hours. No parchment bears the details of his pain. But his sudden transformation from denial to confession speaks louder than words. Initially, he swore innocence. He denied any improper contact with the Queen. But something happened in that house, something that turned protest into submission. The confession he delivered bore not only the claim that he had slept with Anne Boleyn, but dates, places, moments, precision that suggested one of two things: either a well-rehearsed lie or a desperate effort to tell them what they wanted to hear. Contemporary observers and later historians alike suspect torture, whether by the rack, threats of dismemberment, or psychological manipulation. Smeaton was pushed past the breaking point. His was a confession not of guilt, but of survival instinct. Cromwell now had the smoking gun. One name, one scandalous tale, one commoner willing to claim he had been in the Queen's bed. And with that, the floodgates opened. But Cromwell was not building a case of passion. He was constructing a narrative of conspiracy. One man would not suffice. The Queen, to be hated and feared, must be insatiable, dangerous. A temptress who had turned not one, but many of the king's trusted men into traitors. Thus began the calculated arrests, each one picked with a different symbolic weight. Henry Norris was next. He was no idle courtier. He was the king's groom of the stool, a position of trust so intimate that few modern equivalents exist. Norris had been with Henry for over a decade. He knew the king's secrets, fears, and whims. And perhaps that was the true threat. On May 1st, 1536, during the revelry of May Day, a holiday of joy and fertility, Henry abruptly rode off in the middle of the festivities. Moments later, Norris was arrested. The setting couldn't have been more deliberately cruel. To pull a man from a festival celebrating life and throw him into a prison of death was a symbolic statement. The rot had reached the heart of the court. Norris denied everything. Under interrogation, he held firm. His refusal to confess is telling a man either confident in his innocence or aware that no confession would spare him now. Some believed he was offered mercy in exchange for admission. He refused. William Brereton was next. A Welshman with a strong local power base, Brereton had long held regional authority that may have drawn Cromwell's resentment. His arrest served a double purpose: deepen the web around Anne and eliminate a rival. He was accused not only of adultery, but of conspiring to murder the king. This escalated the charges from moral scandal to regicide, treason in its highest form. The implication? That Anne had not only corrupted the court but sought to place a puppet husband on the throne, her lover as king, herself as sovereign in all but name. This was not just about sex anymore. It was about power. Then came Francis Weston, barely 25, newly married, and from a prominent family. His inclusion in the charges shocked many. He had no reason to endanger his future, his marriage, or his standing. He had everything to lose, and yet was swept up in the storm. To many, Weston's arrest made no sense. But that was precisely the point. Cromwell didn't need guilt. He needed volume, confusion, shock value. Each new name pulled into the conspiracy made it more real in the minds of the people, more monstrous. And still, Cromwell was not done. On May 2nd, the accusations turned inward, into the core of Anne's world, into her blood. George Boleyn, her brother, was arrested. He had always been close to Anne. Too close, some whispered. Their bond, built on mutual ambition and shared triumphs, now became the basis for the most shocking charge of all: incest. Even in the twisted landscape of Tudor politics, this was nearly unthinkable. But that was the brilliance of it. To accuse Anne of bedding her brother was to strip her of any remaining humanity. She was no longer a wife who had strayed. She was unnatural, unholy, and anyone who defended her would be stained with that same brush. George, like Anne, was brilliant. He had a sharp tongue and a sharper mind. He had helped shape the Protestant Reformation within England. He was a diplomat, a poet, a reformer. But he was also proud, and pride, in the eyes of men like Cromwell, was a crack in the armor. With the arrest of her brother, Anne's world collapsed entirely. Her support system, her allies, were now labeled her lovers. Her family had become her scandal. No voice could rise in her defense now without fear. It had taken just 5 days. 5 days for Thomas Cromwell to dismantle the Queen of England. 5 days to transform Anne Boleyn from consort to conspirator, from mother of the king's heir to monstrous betrayer. And Anne herself? On May 2nd, 1536, the very day her brother was seized, Anne was arrested after watching a tennis match. She had just returned to her rooms when she was informed. The charges were read to her by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, the same man who had benefited from the Boleyn rise, now delivering the instruments of their fall. The words he spoke were cold, almost ceremonial. Adultery, treason, incest. Anne laughed, not from humor, but from disbelief. She, the Queen, supposedly had found the time and freedom to conduct affairs with 5 men, all under the relentless scrutiny of court life, watched by dozens of attendants and enemies, but as each charge was read, her laughter faded. By the time the guards took her to the Tower, she was silent. And the river that had once carried her in triumph to coronation now bore her back not as a queen, but as a prisoner. The Thames was quiet, as the barge carried Anne Boleyn to the Tower of London, too quiet. Now, the cheers were gone. The pageantry had curdled into dread. She was not arriving for a coronation, but for confinement. 3 years earlier, she had taken this same journey in reverse. Then, the river was crowded with boats, the banks lined with cheering crowds, and Anne had worn cloth of gold and carried the weight of England's expectations on her shoulders. On that day, she had been the king's radiant bride, about to be crowned queen. The silence of the water mirrored the silence of the court. No one dared speak in her defense. No protest was raised. The web woven by Cromwell had ensnared too many, too quickly. Fear gripped even the most powerful families. To defend Anne was to invite suspicion, and suspicion was a death sentence. Upon arriving at the Tower, Anne was placed in the same royal apartments that had once housed her during her coronation preparations. It was an intentional cruelty, a ghost of her former glory, now a lavish prison cloaked in memories. The rich tapestries, the carved wood furniture, the embroidered pillows, all reminders of what she had once been and what she would never be again. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, had been instructed to watch her closely and report everything, every word, every gesture, every flicker of emotion. He was not just her jailer. He was her chronicler. Anne tried to remain composed. At times, she succeeded. She declared her innocence. She asked logical questions. She expressed shock that Henry, her Henry, would ever believe such lies. But the mask would crack. There were moments when Anne wept inconsolably, when she asked if the king truly meant to kill her, when she questioned whether her enemies would spare her daughter Elizabeth. At other times, she would sit in silence for hours, staring at the door, waiting for news that never came. Kingston noted it all. His letters are among the few surviving windows into Anne's final days, and they paint a portrait not just of a fallen queen, but of a woman oscillating between disbelief and despair. One of the most haunting elements of Kingston's reports is Anne's repeated insistence that Henry would never go through with it, that this must be some grotesque misunderstanding, that he would come to his senses, that love, or memory, or mercy would stay his hand. But Henry was already gone. Even before Anne's formal trial had begun, he had emotionally and politically moved on. The court was being rearranged to accommodate a new queen, Jane Seymour. Pale, obedient, docile. Everything Anne was not. Anne had been fire. Jane was water. Anne had fought for reform, challenged the king, argued theology, and refused to be silent. Jane would not argue. She would bear sons or fade into silence. Back in the Tower, Anne was not yet fully aware of how thoroughly she had been abandoned. She believed in her marriage, believed that it still offered her some protection. But Henry had already nullified it in his mind, and with Cromwell's help, he would soon nullify it in law. Meanwhile, outside the Tower walls, the arrests continued to unfold like an orchestrated play. Courtiers whispered not about whether Anne was guilty, but who would fall next. Her enemies rejoiced quietly. Her allies vanished even more quietly. It was a masterclass in political assassination, one carried out not with blades, but with documents, rumors, interrogations, and silence. Inside the Tower, Anne was alone. Her ladies-in-waiting, carefully chosen by her enemies, served dual purposes: comfort and surveillance. They were her companions and her watchers. Every word Anne spoke was likely repeated back to Cromwell's spies within the hour. And yet, even in captivity, Anne retained the sharpness that had once captivated Henry. When told of the charges in fuller detail, adultery with 5 men, incest with her brother, plotting to murder the king, Anne reportedly said, "I am the queen, not a whore." It was a flash of the old Anne, the defiant queen, the woman who had unseated Catherine of Aragon and defied an empire. But flashes were not enough now. The machinery of her destruction had no intention of slowing down. On May 12, 1536, the men accused of being her lovers were brought to trial. They were not tried together. That would have made defense easier, witnesses more effective. Instead, they were tried in fragments, isolated, confused, and already doomed. The evidence presented was weak, vague conversations, gifts exchanged, glances witnessed in corridors. But it didn't matter. The trial wasn't about justice. It was about validation. The court needed to ratify a verdict that had already been decided. And for that, Smeaton's confession, extracted through pain or terror, was enough. Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston all proclaimed their innocence. None confessed. None begged for mercy. Some were offered the possibility of a lesser sentence in exchange for a guilty plea. All refused. Their silence was louder than any argument. Their loyalty, whether to Anne or to their own consciences, held firm even as the axe loomed. George Boleyn's trial was held separately, given his noble rank. It was, by all accounts, the most dramatic. George defended himself with brilliance and poise. He exposed the weakness of the case, the inconsistencies, the absurdities. For a brief moment, the courtroom leaned in, unsure. Could he actually survive? But then, a single misstep. Presented with a written question to read in silence, a document suggesting that the king suffered from impotence and that Anne had mocked his ability to perform in bed, George read it aloud. Aloud, in front of everyone. It was a moment of defiance, or perhaps despair. But it was also his death sentence. In Tudor England, to humiliate the king even indirectly was a crime beyond redemption. Whatever sympathy George may have stirred vanished in that instant. The verdicts came swiftly. Guilty. All of them. Sentenced to die. For commoners, the traditional punishment was hanging, drawing, and quartering, a death of unspeakable agony. But Henry, always mindful of appearances, commuted their sentences to simple beheading. A mercy, they called it. A clean death. And all the while, Anne waited in her gilded prison, knowing that these men were about to die because of her, because they were accused of loving her, desiring her, conspiring with her. Whether they had or hadn't, the result would be the same, and soon it would be her turn. In a world built on rigid hierarchies and sacred bloodlines, there were few accusations more monstrous than incest. To charge a queen with adultery was scandalous. To charge her with conspiring to murder her husband was treasonous. But to claim that she had committed incest with her own brother, that was a plunge into the abyss. It was an allegation so horrifying that it did not require proof, only suggestion. And Thomas Cromwell understood this perfectly. On May 2nd, 1536, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, was arrested. He was not just Anne's brother. He was her closest political ally, her intellectual equal, her fiercest defender at court. Together, they had been the vanguard of a Protestant future. Their relationship had always drawn attention till they were close. Sometimes too close for the comfort of a court obsessed with appearances and whispers. But closeness is not guilt. There is no credible evidence, then or now, that anything improper ever passed between them. They had grown up in the same crucible of ambition, shaped by a father who viewed children as tools for power. They were survivors of Tudor politics, loyal, sharp, strategic. George admired Anne, and Anne relied on George. That intimacy, under the warped lens of court paranoia, became the perfect target. Cromwell's aim, in accusing George of incest, was not to convince, it was to silence. The horror of the accusation was the point. It stained Anne so completely that even those who might have pitied her now turned away. Who could defend a woman branded with that word? Anne was in the Tower, isolated, humiliated, uncertain if she would even live another day. And now, she was told that her own brother, the one person who might have defended her in public and in private, had been accused of sharing her bed. Witnesses report that Anne was deeply shaken. At first, she could hardly believe it. She thought the accusations absurd, laughable even. But as they piled upon one another, the laughter turned to disbelief, and then to horror. She asked to see her brother. The request was denied. This denial was not about logistics. It was strategic. Cromwell understood that if Anne and George were allowed to speak privately, their stories could align, their spirits could strengthen. He needed them broken and apart. George, meanwhile, was facing his own torment. Held in the Tower, he prepared to stand trial before a hostile jury, accused not only of incest, but of aiding Anne in plotting the king's death. These were not just crimes of lust, they were crimes against the state, against the divine order. His trial on May 15th was a spectacle. George was known for his wit and eloquence, and he used both. He mocked the charges, he pointed out inconsistencies, he defended his sister with dignity and passion. Contemporary reports suggest that, for a time, he had the crowd and even the jury on his side. And then came the fatal mistake. He was handed a piece of paper with a question on it, one meant for his eyes alone. It referenced a private conversation, that Anne had once said the king was not skilled in bed, and that she believed he suffered from impotence. George, whether out of defiance or despair, read the question aloud. The moment the words escaped his lips, the courtroom froze. To humiliate the king's masculinity, even in implication, was a capital offense in its own right. But to do so publicly, in front of peers and nobles, was an act of social suicide. The verdict came soon after. Guilty. He would be executed by beheading, a relative mercy, only afforded because of his noble blood. But George was not alone in that fate. Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston had all been condemned as well. 5 men, tied together by accusations that ranged from implausible to grotesque. On May 17th, they were led to Tower Hill. It is said that Mark Smeaton, the man whose confession had started it all, maintained his guilt to the end, whether out of fear, resignation, or a belief that he could still protect someone else. We will never know. But the others, Norris, Brereton, Weston, and George, all proclaimed their innocence. Their final words were noted by chroniclers, etched into the memory of the age. George Boleyn's speech was dignified, calm, and tragically noble. He died not as a traitor, but as a brother, refusing to curse those who condemned him, refusing to tarnish his sister's name even with his final breath. Anne, locked in her Tower apartments, heard the bells toll. She heard the footsteps of the crowd, the shouts, the muffled prayers. She would have known the men were dying now. For her, whether guilty or not, they were dying in her name. The psychological cruelty of this moment cannot be overstated. Anne had been made to watch, to listen, to count the hours and imagine the blade falling, not on her own neck, not yet, but on those of men she had known, perhaps loved, certainly trusted. This was not just execution. It was psychological torture. And the tower itself seemed to absorb that pain. The very walls, steeped in the blood of centuries, became witness to a queen's slow unraveling. But the show was not yet over. Anne's trial had been scheduled last, not because it was the most important, but because it was the grand finale, the dramatic crescendo to Cromwell's symphony of destruction, and it would be held within the tower itself, a decision as symbolic as it was strategic. Because for Anne Boleyn, the walls of the tower were no longer just stone. They were judgment. They were memory. They were death. The river had brought her back to the tower. Now, the law would drag her deeper into its cold belly. Anne Boleyn's trial, one of the most infamous in English history, was set not in Westminster, where crowds might gather in protest, but inside the walls of the very fortress that held her prisoner. This was not simply a matter of security. It was a calculated move. The tower offered Henry control over the setting, the mood, the outcome. And Anne, stripped of her crown but still clinging to dignity, would face her accusers in the place where she would also be executed. It was May 15th, 1536. The great hall of the Tower of London had been prepared for the occasion, not with grandeur, but with solemn finality. A throne for the Lord High Steward. Benches for 26 peers of the realm, some of whom owed their titles to Anne's rise, and now owed their safety to her fall. And at the center of it all, Anne. She wore a black gown the color of mourning with a crimson kirtle beneath. Some interpreted it as symbolism, mourning for her fate, and the red for martyrdom. Others whispered it was simply what was left to her. She walked into the chamber with her head high, her gaze steady. Whatever fears she carried inside, she did not show them. Among the peers sat her own uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, presiding as Lord High Steward, the man who had read her arrest warrant, and now stood ready to pronounce her sentence. It was a tableau of Tudor brutality, family bonds crushed under the weight of ambition and survival. The charges were read aloud, each one darker than the last. Adultery with Henry Norris on October 6, 1533. With William Brereton on November 8, 1533. With Mark Smeaton on April 26, 1536. With Frances Weston on May 20, 1534. And incest with her brother George Boleyn on November 2, 1535. Each accusation was delivered with unnerving specificity, exact dates, exact places, as though this precision could lend legitimacy to the grotesque. But that very precision raised questions. On some of those dates, Anne was known to be recovering from childbirth or miscarriages. On others, she was surrounded by dozens of servants and ladies in waiting. The notion that a queen under constant surveillance could have conducted 5 secret affairs stretched belief to its breaking point. Then came the final blow. She was accused of plotting the king's death, that she had compassed and imagined his demise, with the goal of marrying one of her lovers afterward. This was not just about moral corruption, it was treason, regicide in the making. Anne listened silently. She did not flinch. Her face, according to observers, was composed, pale, but resolute. She denied each charge with unwavering clarity. "I do not say I have been faultless," she reportedly said, "but I have not wronged the king. In another world, one less soaked in fear and blood, such poise might have moved the court. But not this one, not now." The verdict was predetermined. The trial was theater. Anne was an actress in a play whose ending had been written long before the curtain rose. She was not allowed legal counsel. She could not call witnesses in her defense. The prosecution relied heavily on hearsay servants who claimed to have seen glances, overheard words, interpreted gestures. One of the most damaging testimonies came from Lady Wingfield, a former lady-in-waiting who was already dead at the time of the trial. She was said to have warned others of Anne's conduct, yet being dead, she could not clarify, retract, or defend her words. Her silence was used as a weapon. Anne's legal isolation was total. When the peers retired to deliberate, they did not take long. They knew what the king expected. The guilty verdict was announced by Norfolk, with what some described as a trembling voice. Whether it was grief or fear, no one could say. Anne was sentenced to death either by burning or beheading, at the king's pleasure. Even in punishment, Henry retained the final choice. Even in death, Anne was not free. She accepted the sentence with a composure that stunned even her enemies. She asked that God save the king, and once again declared her innocence. Then she was led back to her chambers. But what awaited her, there was not solitude. It was the long and agonizing wait, the slow unraveling of her hope, the gradual collapse of her faith that Henry might yet change his mind. Sir William Kingston continued to record her behavior. He noted that she moved between states, one moment laughing at the absurdity of her charges, the next dissolved in tears. She prayed, she wrote letters, she asked to see Elizabeth, a request that was denied. At night, she lay awake, listening to the tower's sounds, the murmurs of guards, the tolling of bells, the distant hammering of wood. Every sound a reminder that her world was vanishing. Anne still believed that Henry might show mercy, that their past, their child, their love once so powerful it had reshaped a nation, would stay his hand. But Henry had already acted. Even before her trial concluded, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer had been summoned to Lambeth Palace. There, he declared Henry and Anne's marriage invalid. The grounds? Henry's earlier relationship with Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn, a relationship long known, but now convenient. In a moment of cruel hypocrisy, Henry erased their marriage entirely. Anne had been condemned as an adulteress within a marriage that legally had never existed. This was more than legal manipulation. It was personal annihilation. In a single blow, Anne was no longer queen. Her daughter was no longer legitimate. Her entire legacy was dissolved. The charges against Anne were monstrous, but the machinery behind them, the cold, calculated erasure of her life, was something worse. It was the quiet horror of power, unrestrained. As the tower walls absorbed the final echoes of Anne Boleyn's trial, time began to collapse around her. Every hour felt like a reckoning, every breath a stolen moment. Now condemned, stripped of her title, and erased from the political ledger of England, Anne was left with only one possession: time. But even that was borrowed, and the debt would come due in blood. Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower, recorded her final days with bureaucratic precision. His letters to Thomas Cromwell provide rare glimpses into Anne's shifting emotional state, a woman oscillating between poise and panic, prayer and disbelief. She still hoped. At first, she believed Henry would spare her, that he would send her to a nunnery or exile her abroad, that the shared history between them, the passion, the child, the years of upheaval they endured for each other, might still shield her from the axe. But every sunrise brought no pardon, and as the days stretched, her moments of hope became fewer, her prayers more desperate. On May 18th, the day before her execution, Archbishop Cranmer visited her in the Tower. It was an act of spiritual finality. He heard her confession and administered the sacrament, the last rites of a woman condemned, not only by the state, but, in the eyes of many, by God. Anne spoke with clarity. She maintained her innocence. She confessed no treason, no adultery, only her sins as a mortal, a woman, a wife who had failed to please her king. This detail is critical. Anne could have used this moment to admit guilt in exchange for mercy for her daughter Elizabeth. but she didn't. She would not stain her legacy with a lie, even if that legacy would be buried beneath stone and silence. That evening, Kingston informed Anne that her execution, originally scheduled for the 18th, had been delayed. The swordsman from Calais, chosen by Henry himself for his mercy and precision, had not yet arrived. Anne wept. This delay, though short, was torture. She had prepared her mind for death. She had said her goodbyes to her ladies, written letters, selected the clothing she would wear to the scaffold. Now she was forced to endure another sleepless night in limbo. She had been ready, and the Tower had not yet claimed her. There is a surreal detail from Kingston's report that has haunted historians for centuries. Anne, believing her execution would occur on the 18th, awoke before dawn and began preparing herself. When Kingston arrived and told her it was postponed, she reportedly laughed, wept, and then remarked, "I thought to be dead by this time and past my pain." That line, simple, human, heart-wrenching, captures the psychological abyss in which she now lived. The next morning, May 19th, there would be no more delays. As the sun rose over the gray waters of the Thames, Anne dressed herself in a gown of dark gray damask with a white chemise beneath. These were not just garments. They were her final message to the world: mourning and purity. Her hair, once her crown, the same hair that Henry had run his fingers through, that poets had compared to polished mahogany, was bound up beneath a white coif to keep the blade's path clean. Even now, practical to the end. Her final meal was sparse: bread, a little wine. She ate not from hunger, but from ritual. The act of eating was a tether to the world, a way to remind herself, "I am still here, still alive." But not for long. Meanwhile, outside her window, workmen laid the final planks for the scaffold. The crowd was gathering. This was no ordinary execution. This was a queen. Never before had an English monarch executed his wife, and never had the English people seen such a macabre theater of power. Among the spectators were noblemen who had once bowed to her, merchants who had toasted her coronation, women who had envied her gowns and wit. Now they came to watch her die. Some were there for justice, others for spectacle, but many, many more came in silence. Perhaps they didn't know what to believe. Perhaps they simply came to bear witness to history, to stand in the shadow of power and blood. Shortly after dawn, Sir William Kingston entered Anne's chambers. "It is time," he said. She rose. Witnesses wrote that her demeanor was calm, almost serene. She had rehearsed this moment. Every step was deliberate, every breath calculated. She knew that she would be remembered not just for her crimes, real or imagined, but for how she met death. And so, she gave them a performance. With her ladies trailing behind, Anne walked from the Queen's house to the scaffold on Tower Green. The path was short, but it felt eternal. These were the same stones she had walked during her coronation 3 years before, when London had hailed her as Savior, Queen, and Mother of the Future. Now they received her as a traitor. As she mounted the scaffold, she turned to face the crowd. Her final words were brief. She asked the crowd to pray for the king, for he is a good and gracious Lord. She made no confession. She proclaimed no guilt, nor did she protest innocence in a way that might inspire rebellion. Her speech was neutral, controlled, a masterclass in political death. Then she turned to her ladies, removed her jewelry, and handed them her prayer book. She knelt, and one of them tied a blindfold around her eyes. The executioner stepped forward silent, sword hidden in the straw behind him. In a moment so swift that few saw it clearly, the sword was raised, then fell. Anne's head was severed in a single clean stroke. A gasp rippled through the crowd, not of horror, but of silence, the kind that follows a profound, irreversible act. Anne Boleyn was dead. She was 35 years old. And in that moment, something more than a life ended. A chapter of England's story of ambition, betrayal, and reform was closed, violently and irrevocably. But history does not end with the final breath. Anne's body was carried by her ladies, gently, reverently, wrapped in white linen, placed not in a coffin but in an old arrow chest. The Queen of England, buried like contraband, her resting place, the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower walls, the same place where so many victims of Henry's tyranny would lie, including, in time, her own brother George. No epitaph, no ceremony, no crown, only silence. Anne Boleyn's life had ended in the chill air of a May morning. Her body, once clothed in royal splendor, now lay beneath stone, unmarked, uncelebrated. But while the Tower fell silent, the court did not. Only 11 days after Anne's execution, on May 30th, 1536, King Henry VIII married Jane Seymour. There was no mourning, no pause. The machinery of monarchy spun forward with relentless, almost obscene efficiency. For Henry, this was not shame, it was strategy. Anne had been eliminated with the cold precision of a political purge. Now, her successor, pale, quiet, obedient Jane, would serve a singular purpose: to give Henry the male heir Anne had failed to deliver. To the public, the message was clear. This was not just the fall of a queen. It was the victory of power over dissent. Anne had challenged the norms of queenship, argued with the king, involved herself in policy, taken positions on religion. She had been passionate, clever, outspoken. She had dared to speak. Now, silence was restored. Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, barely 3 years old, was stripped of her royal status, declared illegitimate by Act of Parliament. Her household was disbanded. Her future, once gilded by prophecy and promise, was now clouded with uncertainty. Henry had not only removed Anne from life, he had removed her from history. Her initials carved in palace walls were scraped away, her coat of arms replaced, her portraits vanished from court. It was as though she had never existed, but the shadows she cast remained. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Anne's downfall, basked briefly in royal favor. He had given Henry what he wanted: legal clarity, swift justice, and public closure. But power in the Tudor court was always transactional. In 1540, only 4 years later, Cromwell himself would fall from grace, arrested, tried, and executed without a proper defense. The man who had destroyed Anne was, in the end, destroyed by the same machinery he had once mastered. Anne's co-accused Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and George Boleyn faded from public memory. Their names would live only in association with hers, footnotes in the tragedy of a queen's fall. Yet even in her obliteration, Anne left behind a legacy that could not be buried. She had helped transform England. Anne's ascendancy had coincided with the English Reformation, the moment when Henry broke from the Roman Catholic Church and established the Church of England. Though driven by personal motives, this seismic shift was enabled by Anne's encouragement, her influence, her theological curiosity. She supported religious reformers. She protected Tyndale's translations of the Bible. She helped usher in a vision of faith, not tied to Rome, one that would eventually shape English identity for centuries. But history rarely remembers women for their contributions to ideas. Anne would be remembered for her downfall, for the sword, for the scandal, for the legend. Still, the greatest irony of Anne Boleyn's story is this: the daughter, she died leaving behind the one declared a bastard and pushed to the political margins, would survive every court storm. Elizabeth Tudor would rise, against all odds, to sit on the throne her mother had died trying to secure. Elizabeth I would reign for 45 years, overseeing the English Renaissance, defeating the Spanish Armada, and becoming one of the most powerful and revered monarchs in world history. She never spoke publicly of her mother, but she wore a ring containing Anne's portrait, a private gesture, a silent act of resurrection. Through Elizabeth, Anne's bloodline, so desperately sought by Henry in the form of a son, would instead rule England through a daughter. a daughter of both scandal and salvation. Anne Boleyn had failed to produce the male heir Henry demanded, but she gave England something greater: a queen who redefined monarchy, a legend that outlived the blade. The scaffold was gone, the blood had dried, but something of Anne remained. Not in the court ledgers where her name had been stricken, nor in the heraldic walls of Hampton Court, where her initials had been meticulously chiseled away. Not in sermons or chronicles, where silence replaced scandal. No, Anne Boleyn endured in whispers, in glances, in the unspoken terror of those who had watched her rise and fall. The Tower of London, her final prison, never quite recovered. Its stones had absorbed the spectacle of a queen's death, and in centuries to come, guards would report strange sounds in the queen's house, where Anne had passed her final nights, a woman's weeping, soft footsteps echoing down deserted corridors, and the creak of invisible fabric brushing through shadowed halls. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, Anne's spectral legacy seemed inevitable. Her execution had shocked not only England, but the courts of Europe. Ambassadors from Spain and France, once observers of Henry's grandeur, now described him in private letters as a tyrant. The killing of a crowned queen, the mother of his child, over charges so suspicious, so politically convenient, severed what little diplomatic goodwill remained. Anne's fall was not just a domestic scandal. It was an international disgrace. Anne's fall was not just a domestic scandal. It was an international disgrace. But for Henry, these were minor irritants. He had what he wanted: a new wife, a new path to a son. Still, those closest to the events carried scars, some visible, most not. Cranmer, who had declared Anne's marriage invalid, would later show signs of deep regret, especially as he christened Elizabeth, then watched her stripped of her royal status. Thomas Wyatt, the poet rumored to have once loved Anne, never spoke of her again in public, but his verses would hint at a haunting, a lost woman, a broken court, a shattered world, and among the common people, a quiet rebellion of memory began. Despite the official narrative, Anne became a figure of fascination and, for some, martyrdom. Women whispered her name with a strange reverence. Here was a queen who had tried to change things, who had defied the Catholic order, who had argued with kings and spoken like men, who had climbed too high, yes, but who had seen the world from its summit, if only for a moment. In the centuries that followed, Anne's image would be reimagined again and again. To Catholics, she was the temptress who lured Henry from Rome and birthed the schism of Christendom. To Protestants, she was the heroine who helped usher in reform, a woman who risked everything to support the English Bible. To feminists, she was a victim of misogyny, a queen punished for intellect, agency, and refusing to be silent. To romantics, she was a tragic heroine, beautiful, doomed, the queen who loved not wisely but too well. And to historians, she was all and none of these things. A puzzle half completed, a tapestry torn at the edges. Because the truth is, Anne Boleyn exists in fragments, in letters, in accounts filtered through bias and fear, in court records altered by politics, in poems scribbled by men who dared not name her, in stained glass windows that replaced her initials with Jane Seymour's, in tapestries burned, portraits lost, and voices silenced. Yet she remains. Her daughter would return legitimacy to her name. Her story would be retold, again and again, in plays, paintings, novels, films. The woman Henry tried to erase became the queen whose shadow fell over every wife who followed. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, and Anne's cousin, would meet the same fate on the same scaffold. Catherine Parr, his sixth, would tread carefully, aware that to challenge Henry, even as queen, was to risk the axe. Anne's story set the tone for Tudor queenship, and her death became the measure of royal danger. In the centuries to come, pilgrims would visit the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula not to honor kings or warriors, but to lay flowers for Anne, a queen without a marked grave. but with a legacy written in every stone the tower could never bleach of her memory. May 19th, 1536. It ended with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that follows shock, the kind that rings in the ears after a cannon has fired, after a scream has been swallowed, after the air itself refuses to move. Anne Boleyn's body was placed in an arrow chest, a crude, makeshift coffin not meant for a queen. No ceremony, no royal procession, no mourning clothes worn by her ladies or hushed prayers from the court. She was interred beneath the cold stones of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. No name, no epitaph, just stone. There, she joined the other traitors, her brother George, the men accused of loving her, and, later, countless others who would be swept away by the wrath of kings. It was, in every sense, a burial designed to be forgotten. But Anne would not be. In the weeks after her death, life at court resumed with unsettling normalcy. Jane Seymour now wore the jewels Anne once claimed. The same courtiers who had bowed to Anne's brilliance now smiled for Jane. And Henry, never one to dwell, rode out in grand procession, presenting himself as a man reborn. But power is a hungry god, and those who feed it often become its next sacrifice. Within 4 years, Thomas Cromwell, the man who had built Anne's ruin, would be executed at Henry's order. His head fell not long after he arranged another royal marriage. Henry regretted. The blade always circled back. What of Elizabeth, the small girl whose birth Anne had staked her life on, whose legitimacy vanished the day her mother died? She was moved from palace to palace, her household reduced, her status ambiguous. But she survived, and in surviving, she made Anne immortal. When Elizabeth I ascended the throne in 1558, more than 2 decades after Anne's death, she reclaimed her mother's honor, not with vengeance, but with vision. She ruled wisely, fiercely, unmarried and unbowed. She became the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the monarch who brought stability to a fractured nation and led England into a golden age. And though she rarely spoke her mother's name, Elizabeth's very existence, her rule, her grandeur was a living defiance of the silence Henry had tried to impose. Anne Boleyn's blood sat on the throne of England. Her voice, silenced at the scaffold, now echoed in the edicts of her daughter. History had not forgotten. It had waited. Today, Anne Boleyn is more than a queen, more than a victim, more than a footnote in Henry's violent legacy. She is a mirror, a reflection of ambition and its price, of brilliance and its threat, of womanhood and its boundaries. Her story warns us of the danger of loving a man with unchecked power. It reminds us of how swiftly favor can turn to execution. And it teaches us that even the most brutal efforts to erase a life cannot extinguish the truth of it. 500 years later, we still speak her name. Not because of the way she died, but because of the way she lived boldly, unapologetically, dangerously. Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, reformer, exile, martyr, ghost, erased from history, and yet eternal within it. The steel that ended her life could not cut through the centuries. She lives on in every story that dares to tell the truth.